Welcome to What's Bothering Rashi, Parsha's Dvarim, Tov Pei Vov. So we're starting a new Sefer, Sefer Dvarim. Let's learn together the first Rashi in the Parsha. The Pasuk says, Eilu advarim asher dibra Moshe el kol Yisrael. These are the words that Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to all Bnei Yisrael. Be'ever HaYarden, on the other side of the Jordan, Bamidbar, in the desert, Ba'arava, in the plains of Moab, Mol Suf, Bein Paran u'ben Tofel ve'Lavan, v'chatzerot ve'di Zahav. Says Rashi, Eila Dvarim, Lefi shehen divrei tochechot. These are words of rebuke. It seems that the Pasuk is telling us names of places where Moshe Rabbeinu spoke to them these words. Bamidbar, Ba'arava. Says Rashi, no. Each word here hints to another rebuke. They were rebuked for another sin they did in the desert. Umana kan kol hamekomot she'ich'isu lifnei hamakom behen. We're mentioning here all the places that they angered HaKadosh Baruch Hu, they did something wrong. Lefichach satam et hadvarim v'izkiran beremez. Moshe Rabbeinu is rebuking them, so he's doing it through hinting, names of places. He doesn't want to specify their sin and embarrass them. So he does it in a remez, by hinting. Mipnei kvodan shel Yisrael, in order to keep the dignity and the kavod of Am Yisrael. So he rebukes them in a way, in a side way. What was bothering Rashi? So if you read the next Rashis on the Pasuk, you could see that what's bothering us here is, it says that Eila Dvarim, he spoke these words, Bamidbar, in the desert. But they're not in the desert anymore. They're already in the plains of Moab, getting ready to go into Eretz Yisrael. So Bamidbar doesn't mean he said these words in the place, in the desert. Bamidbar is a hint to something they did in the desert that wasn't right, when they complained, Mi ten mutenu Bamidbar. Another Rashi, Ben Paran u'ben Tofel ve'Lavan, says Rashi, there's no place called Tofel ve'Lavan. There's no such place. Lo matzinu makom sheshmo Tofel ve'Lavan. So it must be he's rebuking them on what they said on the Lavan, on the complaints they made on the thing that was white, the man. They were complaining about the man. And that is the sin he's mentioning and rebuking them here in a remez. So what could have bothered Rashi was that these places, if it literally means places, it doesn't make sense because they're not in these places, and because some of these places don't exist. And therefore, it's hinting to the way Moshe Rabbeinu rebuked them. But the problem is, we learned already that the words, the Dibur HaMaschil of Rashi are important. Those are the words that are bothering Rashi. And the words are Eile HaDvarim, not the fact that it says Bamidbar or Tofel ve'Lavan. So what's bothering Rashi in these words, Eile HaDvarim? So the Maharal right away says two reasons, two things that might have bothered Rashi. First of all, it says Eile HaDvarim, these are the words, and we continue reading. He said this Be'ever HaYarden. It doesn't say what the words are. It doesn't say, it's an opening to these are the words Moshe Rabbeinu said. What did he say? We don't find he said anything. So what's Eil HaDvarim? Where are those words? So says Rashi, no. It means the words he rebuked them in this pasuk in a subtle way, in remazim, hinting to their sins. Those are the devarim. That's one explanation Maral says. Rashi was bothered by the fact Eila Dvarim, and we don't see what those words are. Another thing that might have bothered Rashi, says the Maral, Eila Dvarim, we don't usually find these words. Usually it should say Vayidaber Moshe El Bnei Yisrael. Eila Dvarim, he refers to the first Rashi in Megillas Koheles, where he says that when it says Divrei and Devarim, it is Divrei Tochecha, words of rebuke. So these words, Eila Dvarim, are words of rebuke that Moshe Rabbeinu rebuked Bnei Yisrael, and he rebuked them by mentioning all these names of places, hinting to their sins they did in the desert. So those are the two possible explanations to what was bothering Rashi. Another question Rashi's commentators ask is, we're worried about Kvodan Shel Yisrael, and therefore Moshe Rabbeinu didn't rebuke them explicitly. But yet we find later on, a few chapters later in Parshas Ekev, Moshe Rabbeinu mentions in length the sin of the golden calf, Egel Hazav. He mentions in length the sin of the Meraglim, the spies. What happened to not being concerned about Kavod Israel? Why doesn't he do it there by hinting something? Why only in this pasuk does Moshe Rabbeinu hint instead of rebuking them specifically? So again, the Maharal asks this question, and he gives two answers. First of all, he says in this pasuk there are many, many sins, one after the other. And therefore, if we're going to specify them out, that won't be so kavod. So since we're mentioning so many together, we mention them beremes, hinting to them. Later on, we mention one chet ha'egel, we speak about that, and later on the meraglim, we speak about it. It's not all in one pasuk. That's one answer why here he does it beremes mipnei kavodan shel Israel. Another answer, and we spoke about this in Chumash Bamidbar and Parshat Be'alotcha, is that there's an importance to the way you start something. This is the beginning of a new Chumash. The beginning of a new Chumash, we won't mention out sins and say them out specifically. We mention it in a remes. Later on, in the middle of the Chumash, in Parshas Ekev, later on, we could mention the sins. Moshe Rabbeinu does mention them. But here it's the beginning of a new Sefer. Therefore, mipnei kvodan shel Israel, we don't want to start a new Chumash mentioning bad things. So Moshe Rabbeinu did rebuke them. So we mention it, though, in a remez. Those are two answers the Maharal gives. The Maskil David suggests the third answer, and that is based on a medrash here. The medrash says, Lema davar domeh, letalmid shaya me'alech im rabo. He brings a mashal, parable, to a student who's walking with his rav, with his teacher, and they see a diamond on the floor, a jewel, even tova, and he picks it up, the student, and it's a coal, it's fire, and he burns his hand. A few days later, again, he's walking with his rav, and he sees again a nice precious stone, but he doesn't get close to it because he thinks it's going to burn him. And his rabbi says, don't worry, this is okay, you could pick it up. So to hear, Moshe Rabbeinu was told by HaKadosh Baruch Hu to rebuke Bnei Israel. But he remembered once he was burnt, to say. When the chet mei mariva, the water coming out from the rock, he says, Shimuna hamorim in Parashat Chukat, and he was punished for that because he said it. It seems that he was angry when he said it. So he was worried to rebuke them again. So therefore he rebukes them in a remez, in a subtle way, not straight out, very, very sensitive. But then Hashem says, no, this time you have to rebuke them. You have to rebuke them properly. So then later on, he rebukes them and says the sin specifies it and says it straight out, which means there were two stages. The first time it was really through hinting, because Moshe Rabbeinu was worried, he was nervous after what happened. The first time he rebuked them. And that's in this pasuk, he mentions all the sins in a subtle way. But then Hashem tells him, no, now is the time you're supposed to. I want you to rebuke them properly. And therefore later on he rebukes them straight out and not through hints, just says out what they did wrong. So we have three answers as to why only here does he do it beremes. Either it's the beginning of a new Chumash, like the Maharal says, or because we mentioned many together, like the Maharal says, or like the Maskil David says, that Moshe Rabbeinu did rebuke them twice. The first time he was scared, he did it in a very sensitive way, beremes. But the second time he did it the way Hashem told him to do it. That's very interesting because there are two versions in Rashi. Our Rashi says, Vehizkiram beremes. He mentioned it in a hint. There is another version that says, Vehochicham beremes. He rebuked them beremes. And those two versions really depend on what we just said. According to the Maharal, it makes more sense to say Vehizkiram beremes, because Moshe Rabbeinu really rebuked them properly. It's just that at the beginning of the Chumash, we don't want to mention it out. Or because it's all in one pasuk, we don't want to mention them out. But he rebuked them, not in a subtle way, he rebuked them properly. It's only Vehizkiram beremes. The Torah mentions it in a very subtle way. But according to the third explanation of the Maskil David, really Moshe Rabbeinu rebuked them in a remez at the beginning, the first time, in this pasuk. So it therefore should say, Vehochicham beremez mipnei kvodan shel Israel. So even when you rebuke someone, even when you have to rebuke someone, you have to do it in a very sensitive way if you want the rebuke to be effective. Have a wonderful Shabbos.